I'm Judith Blake, former leader of Leeds City Council, and now I have a seat in the House of Lords. So very passionate about this agenda, it goes without saying. So this, of course, is the Local Energy Planning Panel as part of today's fantastic UK 100's International Net Zero Local Leadership Summit and Conference. So thank you to all of you for joining us. And I'm sure you'll agree that we have a fantastic lineup of panelists, and really hope that you enjoy the session and get your opportunity to contribute. Could I start by offering an enormous thank you to National Grid, who have been a great support for the panel this afternoon. So I know all of us are used to working in this format, but just to let you know how we're going to, very briefly, how we're going to manage the interactive part of this afternoon. We've enabled both the Q&A and the chat functions. Please, if you have any questions for the panelists, could you make sure that you post them in the Q&A function? And if you have any general comments or would like to just respond to any of the other comments that are made on the call, could you put those into the chat box? So we have a great lineup. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on introductions. I'm sure the panelists will highlight the achievements that they want to put before you, because time is of the essence. So each panelist is going to give what we've termed a lightning talk. It's my job to make sure they stick to their 3 minutes each. So brief introductions, please, from the panelists, and a bit about your work, and perspectives, of course, on the specific challenges and opportunities that are related to local energy planning for net zero. Then we're going to have a panel discussion, and then we'll hopefully we'll be able to take as many of your questions that you post in the Q&A box as we possibly can. And could you make sure when you put a comment up that you include your name, organisation and role with your question? It's really helpful for the panelists to know who they're responding to. So to the issue at hand, of course, we know that future power will be generated locally, and technology isn't the problem. We have smart energy storage solutions, but we lack a pragmatic and integrated plan for decentralized energy systems at scale. Energy decentralization is a critical part of delivering a grid capable of supporting the transition to net zero. Effective and joined up national and local area energy planning will be crucial to a successful decarbonisation of our communities and economy. So let's get on with the panel contributions. It's my very great pleasure to welcome Cheryl Hiles, our first panellist, and Cheryl is the Director of Energy Capital at the West Midlands Combined Authority. Welcome, Cheryl.
Thank you very much, Baroness Blake, and good afternoon, everybody. As Baroness Blake said, I'm Cheryl Hiles. I'm Director of the Energy Capital Partnership at the West Midlands Combined Authority. And for those of you who don't know us, we were established by the Mayor of the West Midlands to explore new models of energy governance and delivery. And we've been working with partners for the last 4 years on energy innovation systems. We've already heard Mayor Andy Street explain that the West Midlands, for them, achieving net zero is not all about large scale clean energy generation, but it's about ensuring we have the infrastructure we need to support and enable the decarbonisation of our buildings, our transport systems and our industry. There's a net importer of energy in the West Midlands. We need to ensure that our energy is both used efficiently, but moreover that it's used in a smart way to ensure that the cost of the transition is kept to a minimum and that demand doesn't overburden the system. So this is the reason why for us, establishing smart local energy systems, developing them in local energy innovation zones, and being clear about how these can support infrastructure investment decisions are key priorities for us at Energy Capital. The process of local area energy planning that's already been mentioned is certainly a key part of this. Enhanced coordination across spatial planning, transport planning and energy planning is critical to achieving our net zero goals, and we know that. there is definitely a role for deeper engagement here between local government and energy systems planners, and I think that's really clear. But for us, the critical part of this is how this actually affects delivery and investment decisions within a local area. I think a key message of the conference so far that I'd highlight again in this context is that there's no point in having a plan if there's nobody that has the capability and responsibility to take the delivery of that plan forward. So our journey to date has shown that a lot can be achieved through the desire just to work together and create something that's greater than the sum of its parts. However, our next step on the net zero journey is to engender shared responsibility for achieving net zero locally. We're in the process in the West Midlands of establishing a net zero infrastructure delivery board, and this will hopefully take collaboration to the next level. We plan to bring together those who have responsibility for investing in the energy infrastructure and the connected assets that go alongside that to enable the transition to net zero, with the aim to establish mutual accountability. So that means asking infrastructure providers to kind of report their progress on delivering our shared net zero objectives, as well as planning for them, and demonstrating to Offgem, hopefully, what enhanced collaboration between DNOs and local stakeholders can actually look like in practice. We also want to establish a mechanism for achieving robust investment adjustments. So collaborating on energy planning and using the same data and input, the same modelling where we can, those processes can work together within the current regulatory framework will be a challenge, but it's certainly something that we're up for looking at and understanding. And exploring with DNOs and Offgem how reopeners could be applied effectively to adjust levels of energy infrastructure investment in a local area. And finally, we want to establish a mechanism for putting place-based considerations into energy policy and regulation. I think we've heard quite a lot about that today already, as it evolves to achieve our net zero goals. As Andy and others have said, now is such a crucial time to support government with key policy and regulatory decisions to enable the transition to net zero. So today we've produced an addendum to the communique that's been talked about throughout today's event, which sets out details relating to item 4 on energy systems and explaining how we plan to begin an open conversation with government, sort of launching our energy systems pathfinder, which was announced by Mayor Andy Street earlier in the year, and feeding into government our learning to ensure that the outcome of what we develop and test here in the West Midlands can enable effective energy planning and delivery nationally. That's all from me.
Hey, thank you. Thank you so much, Cheryl. And we'll move swiftly on now to Guy Newell. Very pleased to welcome Guy to the session today. And Guy is the Director of Strategy and Performance at Energy Systems Catapult.
Thanks, Judith. So why should we care about local when we're talking about decarbonisation? It's important to ask ourselves that question before we get into the detail. And of course, you could make a case if you were talking just about electricity that maybe the local doesn't matter so much. You know, you can have a national grid system and it can work like that. But as soon as you start thinking about the next things we're going to have to worry about in decarbonisation, so how we heat our homes, how we move around, what we drive, what our transport system is, etc., then it absolutely becomes a local problem. Because in order to think about the heating system, you need to understand the state of the building stock in a particular area. You need the capacity of the electricity grid, the gas grid in a particular area. You need to, when you think about transport, you need to think about where you might put EV infrastructure, etc. These are local characteristics. The challenge of decarbonising the heating and transport systems of Leeds is very different from that of Cornwall, from Glasgow, etc. And of course, once you start thinking about how all these system challenges, of course, then you've got to think about the electricity system as well. So you've got to think about this whole system together. And we have this huge missing piece of kind of organizational arrangements, governance, whatever the right phrases when we're thinking about these challenges. So this is why, you know, a few years ago we started working at the Catapult. And for those of you who don't know, the Catapult is, we're an innovation and technology agency. So we work with companies who are trying to take advantage of net zero. And, you know, they were often trying to provide cost-effective local solutions, but it was very hard for them to understand how they fit in the local infrastructure. So we developed this approach of local area energy planning, and we piloted it in 3 areas in Newcastle, in Bury, in Greater Manchester, and Bridgend in South Wales. And just very briefly to describe what is a process which normally takes 12 months to come up with a decent local area energy plan, you need 3 things. First of all, you need decent data about what is happening in an energy area. You need to understand where the substations are, where the gas entry points are, all of these kind of issues. And then that allows you to build a decent model of what's going on in a local area. And then you need to think through what the different transition pathways, because there's a kind of often a presumption, it's just like, oh, it's very simple, we'll just make all of our houses passive standard, etc. But you've got to work out how much that is going to cost. Is that the most appropriate pathway for a particular area? So you've got the data first, then you've got this planning process, think about scenarios going forward. And finally, just as important as everything else, you have to consult locally. You have to help build the consent for some of the significant changes which are going to happen to people's lives. So that's about important stakeholders like networks, but it's also about the people who live in an area. Now, of course, once you've got the plan, that's not enough, cannot just sit on a shelf. You've also got to think about, you know, implementing that plan. And we're seeing that in Manchester. We're seeing the plans that Cheryl talked about in the West Midlands. We're seeing, you know, great activities across the country in cities and places across there. But what we now need to do is, once we've worked out that local is important for the problem and how you might tackle that, we then need to embed it in the policy area. So quick shopping list of what needs to happen, and this links with the kind of brilliant communique today, which I really hope galvanizes government to think seriously about the role of local. So first of all, one, you need to join up this kind of never-ending number of pots of money that can align, that can support net zero. You need to line them up with net zero. So local pots of money, stuff that's replacing ERDF, UK Shared Prosperity, etc. Those need to be built on a plan. That's also a challenge for the new National Infrastructure Bank. That should also be based on a plan, because that makes sure that the projects that are supported are helpful for the system decarbonisation. They're not just one-off projects that don't fit in the wider system. They really benefit the changes. You need local area energy planning to be a requirement for local authorities or combinations of local authorities. You need that to be joined up with the network process, network control, price control process that Offgem mandates. And Offgem have made tentative steps in that direction, actually probably more than tentative steps, which is great to see, but it needs to be more embedded. You need to join it up with markets and getting market design right, so that local smart decentralized options can really deliver. And the final point I'd make, and it's great to hear Cheryl talk about the pathfinders, is you also need to choose a select few places in the country and really go for it on net zero. Really understand how this is going to work in practice, because it's a huge engineering challenge, making sure your transport, your heating, your electricity systems are all going to work, and that they work smoothly for consumers. And so the plan is the backbone of that, and then it can expand out into the kind of pathfinder sites, which would be galvanizing projects across the country. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Guy. We'll move swiftly on, thank you, to Graham Cooper, who is the Head of Future Markets at National Grid, and among many other things in his very busy time, he's the lead for National Grid on the work around transport decarbonisation. Thanks, Graham.
Yes, thank you very much, Judith. I very much appreciated, and I'm conscious that we're tight on time from a slightly late start, and as most people who know me know that I could fill hours, so I'm going to try and be uncharacteristically short and try and take a real quick snapshot. Look, from an energy system perspective, we have global climate change, we have national targets and national objectives, and they need to be interpreted locally. The challenge that we have, as Guy's pointed out, is we need to take people with us on the journey. So the journey is not a case of just decentralized energy, because how are we going to join up large nuclear, large offshore wind and interconnection? It's a case of it needs to be and lots of decentralized and broader network. It's a case of both. It's not either or. And when we look at the challenges that face us, we follow lots of great guidance. So if we follow the Committee on Climate Change's balanced pathway to net zero, we will have an electricity system that has twice the electricity consumption by 2050. That means we're going to need 4 times the amount of renewables than we have today. And that is going to need twice the grid. Now, they don't mean twice the wires. We're just going to need to have roughly broadly twice the amount of energy and flexibility moving around. So with energy networks being the enabler of net zero, we need to think about how the energy networks help stimulate the markets rather than traditionally react to them. If you think about how energy markets have responded in the past, particularly energy grid connection utilities, we respond to very mature technologies, we respond to very mature markets. But on the journey to decarbonising transport and heat and big industry, these are not established markets. So something has to give a little bit. And this is where we've started to see 1 or 2 of those things happen around stimulating markets where there is a real obvious market failure. I'll give the example of government's Project Rapid and the Project Rapid Fund trying to future-proof grid capacity at motorway service areas and strategic road network. It's not doing the charging. That's a very liquid market. But the challenge is that having the right grid capacity future-proofed in the right location at the right time. So the other interesting thing from our perspective is in the past, we've had time. You know, one of the interesting metrics that isn't measured under things like license condition from our regulator like Offgem is they consider economic and efficient. Economic and efficient is around costs today and how that's borne in future consumers. We've got a great new externality, which we've never had to contemplate before, which is time. We've less than 9 years to 2030. So we've got to connect an additional 30 gigawatts of offshore wind to the energy system. Now that clean energy is the energy that will be consumed regionally and locally, as well as locally generated energy. These systems have to come together. And finally, I guess in the grand scheme of things, National Grid doesn't wake up in the morning to just wake up and put pylons places. We realise that many of these local constituencies will have to host infrastructure. Now, you could see that as energy infrastructure being done to them, or they can actually, there's a realisation that they are part of the transition. So for people to have clean heat, clean transport, to have democratisation of energy, we'll need there to be that broader stakeholder understanding of the features and benefits of this infrastructure. So this is national, local, working in collaboration around those big global challenges. So I'm going to stop at that point because I'm conscious we're very tight on time, but very happy to work with regional stakeholders because normally they've been low-level stakeholders. I think there's a real opportunity for local unitary authorities to work very, very closely with utilities to get the answers that work best for them locally. And on that point, I'll stop.
Okay, thank you, Graham. And we'll move on to our last panelist, Katherine Scott, Director of Enforcement and topical for today, I think, emerging issues for Offgem. Thank you, Katherine.
Thanks, Baroness Blake. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Yes, I'm a director at Offgem, and to set the scene on Offgem's perspective, it's our job to deliver a net zero energy system at lowest cost to consumers, and we always have to balance that. But among the things that I'm responsible for is our strategic change programme, looking at the institutional and governance frameworks that we're going to need to deliver net zero commitments going forward. I don't think it will be a surprise to anyone here that in order to deliver clean transport, heat and power, we're going to need local solutions that dovetail effectively with national arrangements, and local authorities who have the unique insight needed to understand where future demand will be are going to be really central to brokering those local solutions. So just a word about what Offgem's doing. As the energy regulator, we're helping to put local energy networks and local authorities at the heart of the green revolution. For example, earlier this year, we confirmed about £300 million worth of accelerated investment in local electricity grids as part of our Green Recovery Programme, which is going to fund over 200 low carbon projects to get Britain ready for more electric transport and heat, including, for example, EV infrastructure in motorway service areas and key trunk roads in locations across the country. Looking forward a bit more, we're expecting that the new 5-year price control for local electricity networks starting in 2023 will massively boost local green energy investment, and will do so in a more flexible and responsive way. Our business plan requirements for the price control require companies to demonstrate how their plans have been informed by extensive local stakeholder engagement. And it's coming through strongly in the draft plan submissions that we've seen so far. We're still processing them, but they came in on the 1st of July. In addition to using local engagement to inform and justify their proposals, many of the companies have put forward proposals for how they can improve and further support local authorities with energy planning and improve capabilities in the area. So I'd really encourage local authorities to look at your networks proposal, as there are some real opportunities here for you to work hand in hand to decarbonise our towns and cities. And it's not all about electricity. We are supporting scoping work on the use of hydrogen and heat networks too, for example, as well as delivering government schemes to support clean heat. So looking to the future, there's no single national solution or set of solutions to deliver clean transport, heat and power. And that's a challenge for a national regulator. We're going to have much closer engagement with local stakeholders to understand their ambitions for energy, how patterns of demand for energy are going to change, and how we can ensure we've got the right infrastructure in place to enable those changes in the most efficient way. Ofgem's priority is to build a fairer, greener energy system that helps both national and local government meet climate change ambitions, whilst ensuring that costs are as low as possible for consumers and are shared fairly. And so we're going to continue to work with the widest possible range of stakeholders to help to decarbonise our energy system and ensure that our regulatory approach complements the achievements of local and regional ambitions in a way that works for all of us. And I know I've probably gone over my time, but I just wanted to do one quick plug. Offgem is holding a webinar on net zero and our next price control for local energy networks on the 3rd of August. And it's a great opportunity, I hope, for local authorities to find out more about our plans and to how to contribute.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all of you for getting us started on this on the session. I'm very conscious, coming from a local authority background myself, around I think there's an enormous appetite locally to get involved, but there are clearly some regulatory and policy changes that will need to happen to enable local authorities and their partners to really step up to the plate. I wonder if I don't know who wants to kick this off, if you would like to just think about what are the key immediate changes that could be made that would make a big difference in terms of ability to participate and really move things on. Cheryl, you look as though you'd like to come in.
I'm happy to start this off. We've probably all got quite a few opinions on this. I'm really pleased that Katherine's here with us today from Offgem. I think the process that they're going through with ED2 is a really exciting opportunity, and there are some key elements there where we could perhaps see a change, or at least a test in regulatory approaches to involve local authorities and those involved in regional planning in more detail. So sort of some of those opportunities might be to look at what we mean by enhanced stakeholder engagement as one of those aspects, and hopefully we're going to try and demonstrate some examples of what that could potentially look like through our Net Zero Delivery Board and other mechanisms. I think there's also the consideration of customer in a bit more of a wider context. So obviously we always think about individual customers, but within a local geography you also think of your customers from a local authority perspective. So they're not just consumers of energy, but they use all the facilities and services that energy enable as well. So I think thinking about sort of local authorities as strategic customers in relation to the net zero transition is quite an interesting one, particularly given that one of the things we've found through our work in local energy systems is that local authorities have the opportunity to mitigate some of the impacts of the transition. So we can definitely see that there's going to be a change in who's affected most by this movement towards zero carbon. And I think inevitably there's going to have to be investment to mitigate some of those impacts, and local authorities can provide quite a key role in enabling that. I think there's some opportunities around the thought processes feeding into the network charging review and the sort of who pays, the first in the queue pays process. That's another interesting one, and enabling us to look at an area and share that risk potentially when you can see that investment is needed in the energy infrastructure to enable certain investments, how that can happen, and whether there's a mechanism by which we can work together to overcome those sorts of first in the queue pays barriers. And I think there's probably some for BEIS as well, thinking about how we address some of the embedded challenges around fuel poverty. So through eco-funding and the opportunities there to take a more local approach, or an increasing local approach, should we say. I can probably go on, but I'll pass on to some of my other colleagues because I think there's lots of different options that we can perhaps explore. But that's one of the key things about the Pathfinder approach that we'd like to take, is to share share our thinking with government and the evidence that we've got, because there are so many policy areas now that are being updated where we could make some fundamental changes that will enable more effective local net zero transition.
So for the other three of you responding to some of that, what in particular do you think your particular areas, or looking at different stakeholders that you've been working with, can actually come together really to make that place-based approach work? Guy, yeah.
Thanks, Cheryl. The first point to make, just to go on, is lots of local areas are absolutely desperate to have a bigger role in net zero, and to and I'm really ambitious to help their constituents, the people living in the local area, to make that transition. But they really struggle with a few things, because it's not a kind of mandatory requirement for local authorities to think about net zero. Then they don't. Then it's very hard for them to build up the capability in their teams and in their officials to actually be able to monitor, to develop a set of programs, etc., which would be really important. So it's, from our point of view, it's absolutely essential that they have some kind of process like local area energy planning, but equally that comes with funding for the capability and the capacity to do that at a local area, because you can't do it with a quarter of an officer spending a quarter of an officer's time on this. It needs to be properly funded. But the savings, when you're talking about the billions of pounds we're going to invest in the energy system, could be huge. I absolutely echo the point about making it a strong set of Offgem requirements. I think Offgem have got a really interesting question about how far they lean into the role of local, and as Katherine said, they're exploring that and thinking about it in a long way. But does it become a really hard requirement in ED2 and other price control processes? I think that's great. And the final point I said, you've got to get these pots of money aligned which funds projects in a local area, whether it's as I say, shared prosperity money. But they should be a requirement, and they're based on a proper local plan. They're not just a kind of somebody down the golf club suggested a particular project, that'd be perfect kind of stuff. It's like, no, this is in various versions of the future a low regret path, and then that will mean that local authorities looking for funding will actually invest in doing decent planning, which could support lots of these other activities.
So I'm going to pose a difficult question, I know, but obviously we'll be looking at longer term finance from different areas to bring in, but there are so many different local initiatives, as we've talked about, innovation. Where are we going to get the sort of kickstart money, and what are we talking about? What sort of finance are we looking at in terms of the local areas? Don't know if Katherine or Graham have any thoughts about this.
So really, well, I'll happily dive in, Judith. Obviously, there's been the comments around the ED2 price control, which obviously sets up the distribution companies for the period 2023 for 5 years. We're in the T2 price control, which has already started, so we're running slightly ahead. I think the challenge from my perspective when we think about where the funding comes from is, at the moment, we've seen price controls go from 8 years down to 5, which is good because the market's moving quickly. The flip of that is that we now have infrastructure that's going in, is going to be there in net zero. So if we were to put new infrastructure in today, it has a 40-year design life, which means it's going to be there in net zero. So one of the things I'm concerned around is sometimes when you get innovation funding and you get short-term money, it is trying to deploy capital for a short-term basis. But there's a disconnect between the bigger infrastructure, which is more expensive, but longer term. So I guess it doesn't answer your question, but the challenge I think that we will have to grapple with is how do we try to grapple with the world where we've had, which is energy infrastructure needs to be the proved perfect, the long-term perfect, so that it attracts the right funding and is demonstrating economic and efficient, versus the need to go at speed and cover a number of things that are going on. So there is that trade-off between, is the perfect the enemy of the good? As a question that we need to sort of trade off. There is also the element of the risk of stranded assets. We see people say, well, we need to put funding in for transport. But the wires that are going in can do more than just serve transport. They can serve local generation, local trading, local markets. There's a variety of things that can do. So we need to recognize that there is a changing nature of the speed of change that needs to be accommodated financially, and that funding is often targeted around one endpoint use. And the universal nature of energy is it can be used for so many things. So it doesn't really answer your question, but it sort of describes some of those nuggety problems that both as a price regulated monopoly we're trying to grapple with. We're trying to work sort of hand in hand with our regulator, with Katherine and her wider team, as to how will price controls work? Could they work? And is there a level of risk and reward that comes in there? And that's another interesting one, because at the moment having to do more with less, which means there's less appetite to take risk. So there are all those interesting trade-offs. And where I think that funding can be unlocked is if there is really proven sort of local knowledge that considers both the time and the use case and the risk of stranding, then I think there is a case to actually work with the combination of network owners and the regulator to almost test the art of the future possible. Because there is no rule book for getting to net zero. We are all trying to work the least regrets way of getting there. And that's where I think that collaboration becomes really key. If Cheryl, for example, was to come forward with a killer idea that had a relationship with National Grid, why wouldn't we go hand in hand to talk to the regulator to say, what do you think? In the same way, the regulator has to then test, is that economic and efficient? And does it consider both the immediate and the longer term challenges of a regulated monopoly? So it's a real nuggety one around funding.
Yes. Katherine, I saw you nodding when Graham was talking there. Would you quickly like to add something to that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with many of his points. I think one of the things that we've tried to do in designing our new price control RIIO2, and we started it with the transmission and gas distribution price control, and we are trying to increase that flexibility going forward. It is to introduce flexible funding. So we've introduced measures to help to unlock investment. We've included a net zero reopener for green infrastructure upgrades, because we know that it's not possible at the beginning of a 5-year price control in one snapshot to be able to tell exactly what kind of direction that we're going to need to go in because of the sort of rate of change of the energy transition. We've also got innovation funding, which Graham mentioned, which does plug the gap in terms of the short-term stuff. And then we're looking at mechanisms specifically tailored to enable additional strategic investment. And that's where the business plans that the draft business plans that we've seen from the local electricity networks are suggesting ideas and different sort of flexibility and mechanisms that we are looking at the moment to try and develop that further. I mean, you know, in terms of what we can do as a regulator, we have got the price control as a way of funding and helping to deliver net zero. Obviously, we do have to be very alive to efficiency and the stranding risks, and we are having to take that balance looking forward as to where we, you know, how much risk of stranding that we think consumers should take on. But it's against a backdrop of something really quite flexible and different from what we've had before.
Okay, thank you. Well, so much to continue discussing in all of those contributions and responses. I'm delighted now to be able to move on and welcome Hugh Lloyd to the call. It seems a long time, I think, since we discussed some of these things many years ago at different events. Hugh, it's great to see you on the call, and I understand you have a question that you'd like, or again, some comments that you'd like to put to the panel.
Thank you, Judith. You're probably remembering the Creative Councils programme that helped support local government to do some of what we're now describing, but actually a decade ago. My question is perhaps more particular. We've touched on, and I think a couple of panelists have already mentioned this idea of putting place into the considerations for the transition of the energy system. And we've heard, you know, how I think Katherine's mentioned how the DNOs are, in a sense, expected to listen to local voices. I guess the key question is, how do you get to a place where there's something that is approaching place-based accountability in the energy system? How do you get that into the governance? Thank you.
Can I?
Okay, great.
I'd love to pick that one up,
Yes.
because I'm facing these challenges today. So if you look at Boris's 10-point plan and the growth of East Coast offshore wind, there is going to be 30 gigawatts of new offshore wind arriving along the east coast of the UK between now and 2030, and that means there will be more wires. So one of the things in all of the work that we've been doing is to try and work with local enterprise partnerships, work with local MPs, and say, well, instead of feeling like the community is having to host infrastructure, they are part of the journey that's driving the need for the infrastructure, clean heat, clean transport. But if we're having to land a substation, why are we not using that as the catalyst for doing a number of things? Firstly, I guess, nature-based solutions. You know, can we hide substations by strategic planting? Should we bury it, or should we screen it? If we're having grid connections that are being created, why are we not using that to unlock decarbonising heat and decarbonising transport? So yes, you may have to host some infrastructure, but it actually means as a region, you make the journey towards clean heat and clean transport earlier, faster. So there's an element of trying to make sure that we ask, not tell. You know, and that forms, we start that process right the way from pre-statutory consultation. We've just started that on some of those applications, and those will feed all the way through into consenting. But it also means that the consenting environment needs to consider place-based as well, in context with the national need. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all. We are working very, very hard to do that. But if you look at what we do, we're an energy utility provider. We need to work very collaboratively with those who can help with the place-based solutions. So that's why at the moment, the best route for that is local MPs, local enterprise partnerships, and invite them to come and work with us. The challenge is you have to be able to be in a place to have that conversation. We can't be tribal, which is, well, we're just not having any infrastructure. We need to move past that and say, well, infrastructure is needed. How do we find the least worst and get the local greatest benefit for the least worst solution?
Cheryl, did you want to?
Hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Graham.
I completely sympathise with Graham's approach. Yeah, I think that's exactly the question that we've been asking ourselves, the one that Hill's asked. It's all very well kind of planning and thinking about it, but how does it add up to what we need, and how do we make sure that we're responsible for delivering that? And I think actually, if you can get to a point where you have the right people around the table who are all investing in infrastructure to enable net zero, and you can discuss what the objectives of that area are within the context of the wider national picture, then you can start going for some mutual accountability, and that's what we want to achieve through this Net Zero Infrastructure Delivery Board. We want to try and say, okay, we are mutually accountable for this. How do we ensure that we hold each other to account in a way, and we challenge those silos, challenge that kind of individualist thinking, and try and you can't align spatial planning, transport planning, and energy planning. They're never going to align, but you can ensure that they are more integrated through the local energy systems and local energy planning process. And then what we need is that accountable body to make sure that from a local perspective, and I think it probably would be more strategic, although I'm expecting to see that planning done at a very local level. I actually think that working with DNOs at regional level has some value in looking a little bit more strategically, but that's sort of the area which you can hold people to account. And I think the communique asking for consideration of strategic energy bodies in some way is the sort of end point of this discussion. It is who is responsible, how do you make that come about? So that's what we want to explore with government.
Okay, Guy, was there anything you'd like to add?
Just the only point I'd add is government really needs to make a decision on whether it thinks local is important. Central government, I mean, needs to make a decision on whether it thinks local government is important, and it ducks it in the energy white paper. It kind of hints at it, if I'm being charitable. CCC have said it's important. You know, you had Lord Deepen this morning hammering home, but government really hasn't grappled with this question whether it sees a role for anything subnational in terms of decarbonisation, and I think that signal is absolutely essential. And why, you know, the work on the communique today is so great, because you've got you know, a group of people saying, come on, give us some power, we will help here, we will help you with this challenge. But I'm still still trying to work out what government really thinks on this issue, and whether it'll just say, you know, come here and say local is important, blah blah blah, but where's the power, where's the money, how does that join up? And I think it's a key question for levelling up, actually.
Okay, thank you. Katherine, anything to add at this point?
I mean, I think in terms of it, that is an important question. I think that aligning of the national and the local structures, so that there is some kind of form to the whole thing, is really important. I mean, the vast majority of new low carbon assets in the system, such as electric vehicles and heat pumps, and are going to be deployed at low voltage levels in homes and businesses, and so it's impossible to see. There is going to be a need for stronger local decision making frameworks and delivery capabilities, but it's just as Guy says, you know, how do you put that into a structure that really works and that doesn't end up having, you know, decisions taken at the wrong level. If we don't incorporate the local into the wider picture, then it's going to cost consumers a lot more, and it's going to be more dispersed. So I think in terms of place-based accountability, there is this is a bit of a regulatory point, but a range of commentators have set out the institutional changes that they believe are necessary at the distribution level. There's lots of them from iGov and Dieter Helm and Regen, and the common theme for distribution level change includes separation between ownership of the distribution assets and the system operation, and also increasing the use of markets at the distribution level, which I think someone's already touched on. And you know, in Offgem we are considering issues around DNO, DSO governance, and whether, you know, how best to make the arrangements work. And there's more work to be done on this area, definitely.
Okay, thanks, Hild.
Thank you.
Very quick observation, or shall we move on?
I'd happily talk to Graham about how to involve Norfolk and Suffolk local authority county councils in his discussion.
Okay,
we can do that.
Please.
Thank you.
Very happy to take this offline.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much, Hild. And we have our next contributor online, Councillor Rachel Coxcoon, coming on to the call. And Rachel is the Cabinet Member for Climate Change and Forward Planning at Cotswold District Council. Welcome, Rachel. Would you like to put forward your question to So the panel, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. So at Cotswold, which is a relatively small district, we're in the process of updating our local plan, which is actually a very recently adopted one. But when we changed administration in 2019, it was a key thing for us to say that it was just too weak on sustainability and climate change and needed an immediate review. And one of the things we've done is commissioned a big technical study understanding the renewable energy potential across the district for all technologies, so that we can put in policies to identify and protect high generation capacity sites, and how we want energy development to come forward, and what community benefits and ownership structures we would look favourably on. So we're trying to sort of embed that and use it as an evidence base in the local plan. But because this is when I'm not being a councillor, it's also the sort of thing I do for my job. I'm aware that a similar study could have been done for a much bigger region, for the whole of Gloucestershire, for the whole of the Southwest or something like that, for not a great deal more than we've spent doing it for the Cotswolds. And I'm just wondering what the panel thinks is the sort of key evidence and data that government should be commissioning on behalf of all planning authorities, so that we don't end up with 200 or 300 local authorities commissioning similar but slightly different studies to different methodologies that can't be compared across boundaries. And also, how can less well-resourced local authorities, particularly I'm thinking smaller districts, be supported to sort of access and understand and use that data, particularly to support local planning? Because for most of them, that's what they see as their weapon. The ownership of the local plan is what will drive forward spatial development, and therefore, how does energy planning link to it, and how does government help us?
Thank you, Rachel. I'm afraid the clock is really ticking against us, as we had a bit of a late start. So if I could ask you for your responses to be as brief as possible. Guy, can I come to you first? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, if you were drawing a map, if you just think about this from the energy system point of view, and you were thinking, right, how am I going to organise local government so that it lines up with the energy system? It would look absolutely nothing like what local authorities, the kind of patchwork fits there. If you're coming at it from a pure energy point of view, a plan of about 300,000 population is probably about right. So something about, Bristol size, Newcastle size, or over a bigger area if you're talking about a more rural session. So that's what it worked. But one of the things the government should be doing, to answer your question, Rachel, is working out how that could actually work in practice, cross boundaries, banging heads together, etc. And actually I think what needs to happen next is there needs to be a period of experimentation. Let's try it with a combined authority. Let's try it with a couple of councils working together, etc. To be frank, when you're getting down to the kind of scale you're talking about, I think your point's really well made about it's probably a bit small versus what you could have done for the same thing, and you get the same information. So that's one of the things government needs to think about when it's thinking about policy development.
Okay, thanks. Cheryl, could I come to you next, please?
Thanks. Hi, Rachel. Welcome. I think it's important to get the spatial planning policy framework right in the first place. So that's one thing that national government can do is get national guidance really clear, so that there are certain things you do have to debate at a local level and certain things that you don't. I don't think that MHCRG policy has really aligned that closely and kept up with the transition that base policy has been going through. So I think there's definitely an opportunity there for some rapid change. I probably agree. It feels a little bit like the sort of 20 years ago when we first had to go and do resource assessments across the whole of the country, and everybody was looking at what renewables resource they had and where wind might go, and where we didn't even think about solar at that point because I don't think it was economically viable. So there is a kind of what are you aiming to try and do with those assessments? And I think that again is some useful guidance that could be provided to local authorities as to what their evidence base needs to demonstrate and why. And at the moment they're perhaps having to go a lot further because the national framework isn't strong enough and supporting them in their planning processes.
Okay, Graham, and anything very brief, like 2 seconds to add?
Oh, crikey! Yeah, it's a big subject. There are some interesting things coming forward. Just as a quick one, we've got the decarbonisation of transport plan likely to come forward tomorrow. That's one of those really nuggety things, which is hyper local because of transport planning and road planning. But at the same time, people move between different regions. So when you have different emission zones in different areas that don't match up, So I think that there is that element, which is the trade-off between national and local, and it's at the margins is where we will win or lose, be that generation, consumption, whether it be transport or whether it be heat. So for me, trying to work on that interface between national and local government is where the magic here will or will not happen. We also need to try and get to the grapple, which is, why are we bringing power to where transport is? Sometimes it's better to bring transport to where the power is. And at the moment, it seems to be a little bit one way. So I think there are other opportunities to explore in that way, in the same way with heat as well. So yeah, there's a huge local opportunity here, but it's it's the margins. That's where I see the magic being happening.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to squeeze one question in from the chat, and it's from Johnny Sadler from Electricity Northwest. And his question is referring to DNOs, local authorities, combined authorities working together on local energy planning. He's asking, how might that be facilitated, supported, required by Offgem? And do we have many examples of this already working in practice? So if I could go to Katherine for this one, please. Thanks.
Well, I think I would go back to what I was talking about before. Clearly, can I just say first, to close down, that my only comment on, I agree with what everyone said before on the previous question. It is necessary to align national, subnational and local initiatives. And I don't think it's so much a question about having shared evidence and data, but it's about being really, you do need to share it across suitable boundaries, but it's about having a common methodology and a common technical basis to help local authorities. And certainly our hope in relation to the new local electricity network price control that's coming up for 2023 is that as part of the business plans that these network companies are producing, that they are talking to local authorities and drawing in local plans and thinking and about what the future is going to look like over the price control period, but then also over a longer period, and what kind of investment is needed and how to get that investment.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, I'm so sorry we've run out of time for more questions, but I know there's been some discussion in the chat which will continue. But if I could hand over before we wrap up to Talia Berryman from UK 100, who very importantly is going to talk to us about next steps. That's the crucial part of these events, is that we come together, we share our thinking, but how we can move forward in a strong position, having made some of the connections that we have made today. Talia, thank you.
Thank you so much for chairing, Judith. Thank you to our panelists, and also thank you to National Grid for supporting this panel. As Judith mentioned, I'm just going to run through a couple of actions and next steps for UK 100 in terms of local energy planning. Firstly, we will be drafting a letter from panelists and contributors to the relevant ministers and bays to set out what came out of the summit that we had this morning with over 30 local leaders and this conference, and to ask for further engagement to enable local climate action. My colleague Sophie is just posting a link to the communique in the chat, so please do have a look later today. It's fantastic, and we've managed to get sign up from over 30 local leaders on this. So this contains various advocacy asks. There's one on energy, buildings, nature, finance, local powers and transport. So just on the energy one, this includes a specific ask for the establishment of strategic energy bodies or similar mechanisms with the responsibilities and resources to address market failure in energy systems, and with a mandate to satisfy net zero targets as well. So we're asking that these strategic energy bodies have a duty of collaboration, both between public bodies and between the DNOs, and they have consistent approaches to modelling and data usage. We're also asking that these strategic energy bodies are resourced and responsible for local area energy planning, which deliver whole system infrastructure and inform net zero-led capital investment at the most effective geographical level. UK 100 will continue to engage with Offgem on behalf of our members, many of whom are on the call today, in order to enable and accelerate the possibility of local area energy planning, and also advocate that local authorities should be engaged in the development process and that their role is factored into the business plans as part of the RIIO2 process. And we'll also continue to advocate that local authorities have a statutory role in designing local area energy plans. Not much longer from me, but we will continue to advocate to the Treasury and BEIS on behalf of our members and alongside our other partners to ensure that the UK Infrastructure Bank provides financial and advisory support for local authorities to develop and deliver ambitious net zero energy projects. And finally, if you would like to showcase a project that you are doing at your local authority or in partnership with a local authority, please do reach out to me. My email address will be in the chat. We'd love to share as many case studies as possible on our online knowledge hub. These are case studies of best practice on different areas: energy, transport, finance, etc. So far, we have great case studies on energy from the West Midlands, Cornwall, Oxfordshire, Lancaster and Barnsley. So it would be great to add some more on this list. So thanks again for attending, and back to you, Baroness Blake, for closing remarks.
Thank you, Talia. And if we were in the room, this is the point I'd ask you to all put your hands together and thank our fantastic panelists for coming on the call and for sharing all of their knowledge and insights with us. So a lasting message from me. We have gone slightly over, which no one ever wants to do. But just remember that parliamentarians in particular do respond to lobbying. So just keep up the good work, keep pushing the message, and the more informed we all are, the better we can do to reach our objective. But an enormous thanks again to National Grid and to UK 100 for this phenomenal event. And I know a lot of really good positive things will come from it. So we look forward to keeping in contact and working with you in the future. Thank you, everyone.